I stand up and the room is quiet. Hello and welcome. I'm Melanie Holcomb. I'm a curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters, and I'm one of the co-curators with Barbara Boehm of the series Medieval Jewish Art in Context. This is a suite of focused exhibitions. We're on our third installment, made possible by the support of the marvelous Berg Foundation, that showcases gems of Hebrew manuscript illumination and presents them alongside contemporaneous objects, generally made by and for Christians, that are drawn from the museum's own collection. It's meant to draw attention to masterpieces of art that many members of our audience don't know or haven't seen, and it also I think enriches our understanding of the complexities of medieval art and of the fascinating interactions on the cultural realm in the cultural realm between Christians and Jews. This latest iteration, I hope I have to tell no one here, is focuses on the Rylands Haggadah, which is sitting out in our medieval galleries. It's coming to us from Manchester, England, and it's nearing the end of its 6-month sojourn here at the Met. 6 months is a long time for a manuscript loan, and that is made possible in part, obviously, by the generosity of the Rylands Library, but also because of the conservation campaign that was undertaken at that library through support there in the UK, but also through the support of our own resident bibliophile, Dorothy Tapper Goldman. So we thank her. I also call her our spiritual supporter, so she doesn't just support manuscript conservation. If you haven't seen the manuscript, or even if you have, I urge you to head right over as soon as this talk is over. We have been changing the pages every month, and we have saved, I think, the best pages for last. So, and that's where we are now at the parting of the Red Sea. It's pretty spectacular. So, you'll wanna get over there. But now, in preparation for that visit, we will hear a talk by Abby Kornfeld, and it's an extraordinary pleasure for me to introduce her, whom I value as a colleague and I think of as a friend. In the discipline of art history, just like in any other field, there's always chatter about who are the young, promising people, the people of the next generation who give us great hope that the future is in good hands and that the field is heading in exciting directions. And Abby, I hope she doesn't, there's no pressure here, but but there's a lot of that kind of chatter around Abby. Abby is a doctoral student at the Institute of Fine Arts, where she will be defending her dissertation very soon. And the title of that dissertation, I think, will give you a sense of why so many of us are awaiting its defense and with great anticipation. Out of the Margins, Toward a Reassessment of Medieval Jewish Aesthetic Production, is a clever title because it gets at sort of two aspects of her dissertation, and I've been privileged to get a sneak peek at some of the work she's done. On the one hand, she's looking very closely and analyzing very astutely images that are in the margins, literally sitting in the margins of these manuscripts. But in so doing, she's doing this other thing that is really important, which is that she's making a case, a very strong case, that the study of Hebrew manuscript illumination does not belong at the margins of our discipline, but right at the very center. And that's one of several reasons we wanted to have her speak to you as we are continuing this series. Abby's great promise has been recognized by a number of institutions. These include the Wexner Foundation, where she has received their graduate fellowship that is reserved really for people they expect to do great work in the field of Jewish leadership. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art figured this out too, and giving her the Chester Dale Fellowship for the support of her doctoral research. That's when I got to know Abby, and I should give her credit right now for the work that she did in helping Barbara and me to formulate and prepare our proposal for the medieval Jewish art in context. And she's also was also awarded the graduate internship at the Getty Museum. It's a competitive program each year. And so we can look forward next year, into February, to the exhibition, an exhibition at the Getty that Abby prepared, Untold Stories, Collecting, Cutting, and Transforming Medieval Manuscripts. And there's lots more that I can say, but I think we want to hear from her. So with no further ado, Abby Kornfeld will talk to us from slavery to redemption, crafting Jewish identity in the Middle Ages.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the entire Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters, especially to Melanie Holcomb and Barbara Boehm, for having the extraordinary vision and determination to bring a rotating series of spectacular Hebrew manuscripts to this great museum. Thank you to the Berg Foundation for generously turning this dream into a reality. It seems that it's finally time to begin discovering the riches of Hebrew manuscript illumination and medieval art more generally. I would be remiss not to also announce that on Friday, the Jewish Museum is opening an exhibition featuring 60 Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic manuscripts from the University of Oxford's extraordinary Bodleian Library. It promises to be an amazing opportunity not to be missed. So for those of you that are enjoying the taste that you'll get today and what you can see upstairs, I hope that you will find your way just north to the Jewish Museum starting this weekend. Two women preside over the southern transept portal of Strasbourg Cathedral. One stands proudly upright with a crown on her head and a chalice in her hand. The other hunches slightly, angling her soft body away. Her eyes are downcast and blindfolded. Her staff has broken into pieces and is suspended in stone at the very moment of its certain collapse. A book slips through her fingers. There's something alluring about the sorry state of the second woman. She seems far more beautiful, fragile, feminine, and even mysterious. These women represent the triumphant ecclesia or church and the dethroned synagoga or synagogue, respectively. They stand together as one of the clearest representations of the Christian church's official position on the Jewish people in the Middle Ages. The old law has been superseded by the life and teaching of Jesus, the Son of God, whose personal sacrifice absolves the sins of his followers. See how the old law is on the brink of falling through synagoga's fingers. Ecclesia doesn't hold a book at all. Instead, she holds a chalice, demonstrating that salvation is possible not by words alone, but by the Eucharist, the transubstantiated body and blood of Jesus. Therefore, it is in the church where salvation becomes attainable. When confronted with the light and truth of Jesus and his teachings, the Jewish people stubbornly rejected him, choosing to remain in the dark. Therefore, the blindfold over synagoga's eyes represents her spiritual blindness and her continued wrong-headed rejection of Christianity. But why isn't synagoga depicted as a blind woman? Why the blindfold? According to medieval Christian theology based on Augustine's doctrine, synagoga is only temporarily unwilling and unable to see the true divinity of Jesus. At the time of the Second Coming, Jews will recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and synagoga's vision will be restored. The blindfold will fall away. The message here is clear. The Jewish people choose to be blind, clinging to their Torah without recognizing that the purpose of the old law was to reveal the truth of the new. Images of synagoga's blindness appeared all across Europe and throughout centuries in mediums of all kind and all size. driving home this point again and again and again, that the Jewish people choose to live in the dark rather than emerging into the light of civilized Christian society. And I just want to point out on the Psalter image that Ecclesia is actually holding the chalice that's catching the blood that's spurting out of Christ's side wound, where Synagoga over here looks like she's about to fall right out of the illumination altogether. The Jewish people weren't blind at all. They were active witnesses and integral and integrated participants in most realms of Jewish life. I just needed the... Erase! Clear. Okay. Technology is an amazing and dangerous thing. Today, I will argue, through a careful examination of the imagery in a single Hebrew manuscript on view upstairs, here, that Jews of the Middle Ages were keen observers of their surroundings, fluent in the same visual language as their Christian neighbors. They pulled images from the same places and gave them new meanings in a distinctly Jewish context. They selected, manipulated, and adapted imagery in so many creative, exciting, and innovative ways. As I will show, the many stylistic, formal, and iconographic parallels between the Rylands Haggadah and Christian art cannot be explained away as evidence that the Jewish patron who commissioned this work of art was simply the passive recipient of visual culture. In essence, Jews and Christians shared the very same visual languages. Ideas and concepts were constructed visually using the same set of artistic tools and pictorial devices for storytelling. In fact, as we shall see, the very same narrative strategies were appreciated and understood by the sainted King of France and the anonymous patron who commissioned the Rylands Haggadah. By bringing the Rylands Haggadah and so many other amazing Hebrew manuscripts to the medieval gallery at this great museum, the many museum visitors can witness the richly textured visual dialogue out of which this manuscript was produced. Jews across Europe lived and thrived in the 12th through 15th centuries, so much so that the patron of the Rylands Haggadah had the wealth necessary to commission such a luxury object. The massive expense of such a book would have been well beyond the reach of much of the medieval population, Jewish and otherwise. Remember, these are not flimsy paper pages. Each page is a section of stretched, dried, and scraped animal hide, and the vibrant colors were expensive compounds of finely ground minerals, and the gold leaf is gold. This is not to say that the Middle Ages were a peaceful utopia in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted in perfect harmony. Even at the best of times, this was not the case. There were violent outbreaks, discriminatory policies, disproportionate rates of taxation, mandated expulsions, and hateful rhetoric, whether through a polemical sermon or through a gossipy tale of Jewish nefariousness. However, this did not prevent members of the Jewish community from attaining important posts in the royal courts and from amassing healthy fortunes, from sharing in the day-to-day of society, and from commissioning works of art. Let us now turn our attention to the Rylands Haggadah, a manuscript commissioned in the middle of the 14th century in northeastern Spain, likely in or around Barcelona, by an anonymous patron. While we know nothing specific about the circumstance in which this manuscript was produced, what we do know is that the patron, whoever he or she was, by virtue of being the commissioner of the manuscript, and therefore the holder of the purse strings, would have had the most important role in deciding the scope, scale, expense, message, and program of the manuscript. This is not the kind of work that an artist would have created on spec, in the hopes of finding a generous benefactor to afford it. The patron and artists would have collaborated in order to best realize the patron's vision. The Haggadah, which only emerged as an independent text in the 13th century, is an amalgam of blessings, rabbinic commentaries, and biblical texts intended to be performed and discussed at the Passover Seder. the structured ceremonial meal that combines ritual foods with a retelling of the exodus of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. The Passover Seder is unique in that it is the one great liturgical celebration entrusted not to the public worship of a synagogue, but to the intimacy of the family gathering. With such a compelling and spectacular narrative at its core, one would expect the Haggadah, which literally means retelling, to be brimming with vivid tales of brutal enslavement of the Israelites, Moses' miraculous vision of God at the bush that burned but was never consumed, 10 miserable plagues, heated negotiations between Pharaoh and Moses, the slaughter of lambs, the blood from which was painted onto the doors of Jewish homes to signify to God to pass over, and that's where the name of the holiday in English comes from, the Jewish homes as he struck dead the firstborn children of the Egyptian people, the triumphant passage of the Jewish people across an open sea, and the galloping militant forces of Egypt drowning unceremoniously in that very same sea. However, anyone that has ever attended a Passover Seder will tell you that this isn't exactly true. Sure, there are plagues, but Moses' name never appears once, not at all. In reality, the Haggadah spends far more time discussing the significance of the symbolic foods of the Seder than it does actually recounting, in narrative form, the miraculous redemption from Egypt. Because the text isn't intrinsically narrative, finding a suitable strategy for illuminating it provided a challenge. Here, the two central ritual actions are depicted, and on the first folio we see a man pouring and mixing the wine, while opposite is another man reclining, and you can see the little pillow that he's leaning his arm against. The Seder is given its formal structure by the blessing and consumption of 4 cups of wine, and the act of reclining was an antiquated custom adopted from Greek banquets during which all free people would recline on couches while partaking in a feast, and that became an embodied expression of freedom from slavery. By choosing these 2 rituals to illuminate, the patron highlighted the centrality and importance of the wine as the framework upon which the entire Seder is based, and the act of reclining as the means of experientially commemorating freedom. And I also just want to point out here that the one big difference, well, there are many, but one of the big differences between Hebrew and English is that there's no such thing as a capital letter in Hebrew. And so instead of illuminating in a larger scale just a single letter, whole words were taken out and put into word panels to call attention as sort of a subject heading for where it would help to guide the reading and performance of the Seder. In addition to these images of ritualized behavior, what other images might we find thumbing through the text of the Rylands Haggadah? 5 portraits of the various 2nd and 3rd century rabbis whose opinions are preserved in the Haggadah text. These portraits, which were obviously not intended to be real likenesses of rabbis who'd been dead for approximately 1,000 years, convey the authority, authenticity, and continuity of the Haggadah text. To place an author portrait before a text in the Middle Ages was to declare the authority of that text. The image focuses the reader's attention before reading on the voice speaking through the transcribed words. It serves to signal an author's high stature and to establish that author's particular status as an interpreter of the textual tradition. Many medieval authors were depicted in the act of writing their texts, quill in hand, surrounded by scribal paraphernalia, as if these authors were personally assuring the accuracy of the exemplar on which all subsequent copies of that text would depend. If we take the 5 portraits of rabbis and place them side by side, a privilege granted to us by digital technology and the power of PowerPoint, several important conclusions can be drawn. All 5 of the rabbis are depicted as silver-haired and bearded men. This is neither a coincidence nor the result of a lazy artist who chose to depict all men as mature seniors, and as we just saw, we have a youthful brown-haired man before. This trope conveys gravitas, intelligence, time-worn maturity, and a deep understanding. Also, each rabbi gestures to the open text in his hand or to the text that he's sitting next to in the top case, which is, I believe, Elazar ben Azariah. Also, each rabbi gestures to the open text in his hands. Unlike many evangelist portraits that precede their gospel accounts, these rabbis are not shown as writers. There are no quills, no inkwells, no half-written words, blank pages. Instead, they hold up miniature books on which relevant quotations from the Haggadah have been printed in tiny letters. In doing so, the image makes clear that the rabbis weren't the authors of the Haggadah text, but they were the important and decisive interpreters of that older text. Finally, through juxtaposition, it becomes immediately obvious that one rabbi is not like the other ones. Rabbi Gamliel is placed inside an elaborate setting rather than floating unmoored against a blank sea of parchment. And you can see here the little canopy, the architectural canopy that he sits under. Does this mean that he's more important than his peers? Well, not necessarily. The content of Rabbi Gamliel's message that the Passover Seder would be incomplete without a discussion of the three main symbolic foods of the Seder is at the very core of the Haggadah text. Therefore, by visually constructing the extra importance of Rabbi Gamliel, the artist is highlighting the passage that follows. Although the image type derives from a common Christian source, these rabbi portraits highlight the authenticity, authority, emphasis, and continuity of the Haggadah text, and by extension, the entire Seder ritual. The central challenge of the Haggadah is that in every generation, each Jew should feel as if he or she personally went free from Egypt. Therefore, since the Haggadah text is not a straightforward narrative account, the patron of the Rylands Haggadah opted to preface the text with a group of biblical images arranged 2 by 2 that open as suites of 4. This costly addition allowed the patron to set the Haggadah and the Seder ritual into biblical context. The illustrated biblical account functions as the narrative heart that beats through the Seder ritual. The addition of a pictorial introduction to a non-narrative text is not unique to the Haggadah. The strategy of prefacing a book with a suite of images was long associated with the decoration of psalters, the books of Psalms used by Christians in the Middle Ages as a daily prayer book. Because the Psalms were metaphorical songs of praise, which do not obviously lend themselves to illustrations, suites of images depicting the life and passion of Jesus were added before the text began. This way, the flowery poetry of the Psalms was given context, clarity, and relevance. And I just want to add that those picture cycles became so popular that they started appearing with no text at all. And this is a teeny tiny ivory in the Metz collection, which is actually a little booklet that's only 2 inches tall. Even though the pictorial strategy of prefacing a non-narrative text with a suite of images derives from a Christian context, the many nuanced messages constructed in this Hebrew manuscript are decisively Jewish. So the patron of the Rylands Haggadah had a choice. Where should the pictorial narrative begin? The creation of the world, the birth of Moses, and here are 2 other Haggadahs. On the left is the Golden Haggadah, and you can see that the illumination actually begins with Adam naming the animals. That's over here. And in the Kaufman Haggadah, which would have looked spectacular when it was first done after all the pigments have now fallen off, you can see Pharaoh's naked daughters bathing when they miraculously discover a baby floating down the Nile. The patron of the Rylands Haggadah, though, decided against including the long history of the Jewish people from Adam and Eve through Joseph's descent to Egypt, deciding instead to begin the manuscript's picture cycle with the appearance of God at the burning bush. While tending to his father-in-law's flock, Moses saw the angel of God in a blazing bush, and all of the images start in the top right and then read down and across. Drawn to the vision of a bush that was on fire but not consumed by a blaze, Moses approached in order to get a better look. God spoke to Moses, announcing his presence and requesting that Moses take off his shoes, since he was now treading on holy land. In this miraculous moment, God tells Moses that he's heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt, and that he will bring the Jewish people out of slavery and into a land flowing with milk and honey. The storytelling strategy used here is known as continuous narrative. The protagonist, Moses, appears twice in the same visual frame in order to convey sequential actions. So that's actually Moses and then Moses. And you can see that it happens in both images on the screen. First, Moses glances at the bush, and then he approaches to remove his shoes. And you can see he has one shoe off, and it's sitting here, and the other stocking is about to be removed. Throughout this discussion, I will be comparing the illumination of the Rylands Haggadah with that of the Morgan Picture Bible, a manuscript that lives here in New York at the Morgan Library Museum and is available to peruse online. I certainly could have chosen another manuscript from mid-century Catalonia, or even another Haggadah. However, by comparing the Rylands Haggadah to a royal French manuscript, likely made for the sainted King Louis IX, patron of the Sainte-Chapelle, the jeweled chapel in Paris, I wanted to emphasize the pervasiveness of these modes of visual expression. The Rylands Haggadah was made for an anonymous patron in northern Spain, 600 miles away and 100 years after the Morgan Picture Bible was made for the French king. Yet the imagery in the two manuscripts still bears striking and significant similarities. Moses, returning back to the Rylands narrative, Moses, feeling an enormous burden of both responsibility and self-doubt, wonders out loud whether anyone would believe that he'd really seen God. So God instructs Moses to take the shepherd's crook in his hand and throw it on the ground. The staff then turns into a snake, terrifying Moses. Notice how Moses, in the middle Moses, notice how Moses' terror is construed visually by his awkward stance. One leg is in front of the other, as if he's walking this direction, but he twists all the way back in a way that's physically impossible. His body is literally contorting as he recoils in terror. But God reassures Moses, telling him to grab the snake by its tail. Once back in his hand, the snake immediately transformed back into a staff. And here in this image, God's presence is indicated by the wavy blue line cosmos right above. So all throughout, that's how we know that God is present in the scene. But Moses still needed more convincing. So God instructed him to place his hand on his chest, and when he pulled it out, his hand was encrusted with leprous scales. And you can see that diseased hand is a little bit hard to see because there's not so much contrast, is right there, and it sticks over the blue background to show that it actually has been covered with a disease. And then God tells Moses to put his hand back onto his chest, and when he pulls it out the second time, the leprosy was cured. With these miraculous signs as ample proof of his divine mission, Moses took his wife Zipporah and his sons and went back to Egypt carrying the rod of God with him. At a quick glance, the illumination here looks like a depiction of the Holy Family's flight into Egypt, an important turning point in the life of Jesus as told in the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Having heard the grave news that King Herod was planning on killing all the local children, Joseph and Mary packed up their infant son Jesus and fled to Egypt. This episode in the life of Jesus was frequently illuminated as the transition point between his miraculous birth and his triumphal return to Jerusalem. Although the image bears many similarities to the iconography of the flight into Egypt, in both you have a man gesturing to his young family perched on top of a donkey, and the donkey has taken a moment to snack on the vegetation at the bottom of the tree. A closer look reveals our image to be a totally different flight into Egypt. Here, this is a representation of Moses emerging from hiding in Midian and returning to Egypt. This is hardly a blockbuster moment in the life of Moses. This particular flight image departs from the more traditional iconography in three significant ways. First and foremost, at the center of the image, the young mother is carrying two babies, not one. The second difference is the inclusion of Moses' wife Tzipporah circumcising her son along the road, as described by the subsequent verse in Exodus. The act of circumcision, which is understood by Jews to signify the covenant between God and Israel, emphasizes the role of Moses as progenitor and protector of God's chosen people. Finally, the right-to-left orientation of the image is the third and perhaps most subtle departure from the standard Christian iconography. By reconfiguring the image so that it can be viewed in the direction of the Hebrew text, remember that Hebrew is read from right to left, the illumination actively opposes the Christian topos it adopts. And I would also just like to pause here that for an unwitting visitor who wanders through the medieval galleries, probably the only way that they would tell that this is actually not a Psalter but is a Haggadah is that the imagery reads in the backwards fashion. As we've already seen, the context for this flight into Egypt is this series of images from the book of Exodus that preface the Haggadah text. When compared with the other scenes on this opening, the miracle of the burning bush, Moses' staff transforming into a slithery serpent, and Moses' temporary affliction with and subsequent miraculous cure from leprosy, the image of the flight into Egypt seems far more mundane and inconsequential. Each of the other three scenes depict a moment in which God's presence was made manifest on earth. However, in this fourth image, God makes no appearance at all. Instead, Jesus, the alleged Son of God, has been deleted, replaced instead by Moses and his legacy, the children of Israel. By appropriating a common Christian motif, a not so subtle polemic against the singularity of Jesus is made possible. The adapted composition, with the two children appearing prominently at the center and with the ritual circumcision occurring on the left, emphasizes first and foremost not Moses, but his legacy. Moses isn't standing front and center the way he had been in each of the previous images. Instead, he or his offspring take center stage. This significant shift introduces the fruitfulness of the line of Moses, a sharp contrast to the barrenness of the line of Jesus. Sorry, any Da Vinci Code fans. The futility of a Messiah who lived and died without a bloodline was one of the central Jewish rebuttals against the Christian belief in the only begotten Son of God. Therefore, even though the pictorial prototype for this image was an important episode in the life of Christ, the result was a powerfully and specifically Jewish message. When we turn the page, we find Moses reunited with his brother Aaron, and that's over here, excitingly recounting all that he'd seen and all that he needed to do. So below, they gathered together the elders of Israel, and Aaron repeated the words that God had spoken to Moses, performing the miraculous transformation of the staff into a serpent. The elders were both convinced and relieved that God had heeded their cries and would deliver them from slavery. The version in the lower right corner of the Morgan Picture Bible, which is here, deletes Aaron in order to achieve visual clarity and simplicity over textual accuracy and nuance. In the Rylands Haggadah, however, Moses and Aaron greet the elders of Israel together, and they're not wearing name tags, so it can be very confusing to figure out which one's which one. And Moses, who was forever shy of public speaking because of either a stutter or a speech impediment that can be hashed out by the rabbis, stands behind his older brother and gazes up towards God's manifest presence on earth while pointing at the serpent. So he's standing behind, pointing up to the cosmos, and this hand points at the snake as it's being transformed. And while some of the elders are transfixed by the serpent that appeared in the hand of Aaron, the others gaze upward with arms extended in gratitude and praise towards the wavy blue cosmos above. It's also worth pointing out here that by stacking narrative pictures on a page, additional possibilities and connections are possible. According to the biblical account, God appeared to Aaron and instructed him to meet Moses at the mountain of God. Therefore, in this top image of their encounter, the leafy green shrub here that forms the visual semicolon between the two halves of the narrative sentence likely stands for that unconsumed bush. So then, if we follow Moses' gaze in the lower image, Where he looks to be gazing up at the cosmos, his gaze actually goes straight up to the bush above him. With the support of the elders of Israel, Moses and Aaron took their message to Pharaoh and his minions. They requested the Jewish people be allowed to go out into the wilderness to celebrate a holiday in honor of their God's greatness. But Pharaoh was so angered by this audacious request that he added a new and far more strenuous demand for his Jewish slaves. The Jewish people now needed to gather straw, which you can see them doing here, that's the straw, while maintaining the same quantity of bricks produced daily. The imagery formally links these two episodes by a gesture. Pharaoh points one finger back at Moses, here, and the other points down. Oh, I drew over it so you can't see better. And the other points down. Sorry, I lost my place. Oh, and the other points down to the hunched taskmaster, a giant among men. His gigantic stature, which looks even more ridiculous compared to the short slaves, means that were he to stand upright, he would shatter the frame of the miniature, and his hat would brush the feet of Moses. By linking the images in this way, the illuminator makes clear that the decree for even harsher labor came directly from the evil king, who was angered by the demands of Moses and Aaron, and not from some rogue taskmaster in the field. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh, this time demonstrating God's miraculous transformation of the staff into a serpent. This time they thought he'd be impressed. Pharaoh was nonplussed and invited his magicians to perform the same magic through their spells. The magicians successfully transformed their own rods into serpents, and Moses' snake ate the other two, sensationally demonstrating the supremacy of the God of Israel over the magical plurality of the deities of Egypt. But this wasn't enough proof. God stiffens Pharaoh's heart and rained down terror on the Egyptians in the form of 10 gruesome plagues. And the plagues begin here with the bloody river. So first is blood, and then the frogs that are leaping all over everywhere, and the lice, which makes me itchy to even talk about. Then there's a infestation of beasts, most of which here look somewhat reptilian, and a cattle disease, followed by boils and a hailstorm. Then comes the locusts and the darkness, which I will just want to point out is a really clever also response to the synagogue imagery, where here the Jews sit pointing at the Egyptian Christians who are in the dark. And finally, the worst of them all, the death of the Egyptian firstborn, which in this image you can see that it includes the firstborn of every household, which also includes the cattle and the prisoner who has the chain wrapped around his neck. But since he was a firstborn, he also suffered a harsh fate. In April, Mark Epstein gave a spectacular lecture in which he outlined the many fascinating details given in the illumination of each plague. By comparing the Rylands Haggadah with its very, very similar brother Haggadah, which Mark has re-nicknamed the Mother Haggadah, since it was likely the source upon which the Rylands Haggadah was based, Mark highlighted the many ways in which the imagery of the Rylands Haggadah exaggerated the excessive anguish wrought by God on the Egyptian people through each of these plagues. One of the most salient examples of the deliberate amplification of tortures and indignity can be seen by contrasting the image of the plague of boils in the Rylands Haggadah with its brother mother. In the brother Haggadah, on the top right, Pharaoh and his courtiers, and even the diminutive shepherd crouching in the field, appear uncomfortable as they scratch at the sores that dot their arms and legs. In the Rylands Haggadah, however, the illuminator has taken the torture to an unprecedented level. Small lapdogs, and you can see them 1, 2, and 3, lick at the blistering sores, causing additional and agonizingly, not to mention disgusting, cruel pain. And below, the hail that gently displaces the crown on Pharaoh's head in the brother Haggadah, and you can see it's really like 5 hail stones, has been exponentially multiplied filling the interior of the palace with huge stones of hail in the Rylands Haggadah. Meanwhile, outside, an unharmed Jewish shepherd tending to his flock points, and here he is pointing, at the destruction being wreaked on the Egyptian shepherd, who opens his arms wide in panic as the hail destroys his livelihood, his livestock, and probably his life. Throughout the plague imagery, Mark tracked the dramatic amplification in the terrors wrought by God on the Egyptians in the Rylands Haggadah, finding evidence of the triumphalist and vengeful delight of the Jewish people at the misfortune and suffering of their Egyptian masters. He argued cogently that while the patron of the Brother Haggadah wished to emphasize the divine plan through which the Jewish people were once saved and would be saved once more, the patron of the Rylands Haggadah took a more active, radical, and contentious approach, one in which the Jewish people rejoiced in the suffering of their oppressors and actively anticipated divine retribution for continued modern hostility and oppression. For those of you that missed Mark's talk, or for those of you that enjoyed it so much you'd like to hear it again, it is actually available on the Met's YouTube page, which I didn't know they had until last week, along with the talks given by David Stern and Katrin Kogman-Appel on the Washington Haggadah. So I highly recommend that you check them out. So not to simply reiterate Mark's findings, I will limit my remarks on the plague imagery to a few additional points. The prefatory cycle has 26 slots for images following the 2x2 layout, and 10 are taken up by the plagues, meaning that roughly 40% of the images in the narrative picture cycle depict the deliberately extreme gruesomeness of the plagues. These depictions of the plagues are never combined or collapsed in order to allow the illuminator space to better and more fully depict the plight of the Jewish people. And here in the Barcelona Haggadah, another roughly contemporary one, we have a much bigger display of the actual servitude that the Jews were forced to suffer, or even something as saucy as the naked daughters of Pharaoh bathing in the Nile where they found Moses. The designer of the image cycle in the Morgan Picture Bible certainly thought that enough was enough when it came to the plagues. Therefore, the cycle only includes 6 of them, leaving the rest to the imagination of the viewer. And they start here. Here's the blood and the frogs. And here it's really hard to see, but these are little lice that are coming up from the ground. And finally, the cattle disease, the big brown hailstones, which look more like rocks being thrown down by an angry god, and the death of the firstborn. Clearly, in the Rylands Haggadah, the patron had a very keen interest in depicting the miraculous buildup to the Great Escape, not the harsh circumstances under which the Jews lived as slaves for centuries, but rather the spectacular and vindictive force with which God terrified and tortured the Egyptian people before finally setting the Jewish people free. You will have undoubtedly noticed by now that the imagery of the ancient Egyptian world bears no semblance to the actual ancient Egyptian world. Instead, the biblical account is completely recast in contemporary terms. Was this because the medieval patron didn't have easy access to the treasures of Egyptian art the way that we Met viewers do? Like many commemorative rituals, the Seder establishes a fundamental link between past and present, specifically that every Jew has been delivered personally from Egypt by God. The Haggadah states that, quote, "In every generation let each man look on himself as if he came forth out of Egypt," unquote. Therefore, remembering the Exodus was affective and goal-oriented, a call not to reflect, but to act. By visualizing the biblical narrative, a more emphatic experience of the Haggadah becomes possible, as well as an enriched understanding of its contemporary significance. Although the Seder is designed to encourage participants to feel as if they themselves had experienced the Exodus, it is in the illumination that the distance between past and present is collapsed as the biblical past is revisioned in order to uncover and make contemporary meanings. Because there is no record of the person who commissioned, painted, or even owned this manuscript until the 19th century, art historians are left with a series of clues upon which attempts to date and localize its production are based. By comparing the illumination, the ways in which the faces and garments are rendered, the attempts to use perspective and natural atmospheric settings, to that of other manuscripts, scholars guess at a date. It is believed that the manuscript was made sometime around 1340. In reality, though, there's no irrefutable evidence that suggests the manuscript wasn't made in 1350 or even later. It is always easier to argue that a manuscript was made later rather than earlier, since styles and trends have a funny way of recurring, which we know very well from the silent movie that swept the Oscars in the year 2012, and the 80s neon fashion that roams the streets of New York City today. If, however, the manuscript wasn't made in 1340, but in 1350 or beyond, the excessively grim imagery of the various plagues takes on a radically new significance. Beginning in 1348, a modern plague swept across Western Europe, claiming the lives of an enormous percentage of the population. In the wake of the Black Death, gangs of unhappy Christians rioted against the Jewish communities in northern Spain, with attacks documented across Catalonia and Barcelona and beyond. These popular uprisings were considered to be punishment for the crimes allegedly committed by the Jewish people, poisoning the wells, helping the epidemic spread, and inciting divine punishment for their ongoing and sinful rejection of Christianity. Therefore, the Jewish people suffered doubly, succumbing on the one hand to the plague itself, and at the same time enduring the collateral damage occasioned by majority panic and the accompanying hateful rhetoric that pointed to the Jews as responsible for the plague. This is not to say that the plague and the subsequent riots decimated the entire Jewish community, nor did it destroy the vibrant and productive Jewish culture. Jewish people continued to hold important posts in the royal and local administrations, to own land, to study Latin, Arabic, and the Romance languages, to write poetry, and yes, to commission illuminated manuscripts. What if the patron of the Rylands Haggadah had survived the epidemic and the ensuing rioting? What better way to celebrate his salvation than by commissioning a manuscript with an extensively gruesome cycle of plagues, demonstrating visually his own divine providence from that unlucky fate? Seen through this lens, images of the outrageous destruction that God can and will rain down on those people who disobey him becomes immediately and viscerally relevant. But enough was finally enough. So at the command of Moses and Aaron, the Jewish people left Egypt armed with spears, scabbards, helmets, shields, boils, and of course, a kneading bowl, which is right there at the head of the army, so that they, filled with the loaves of the not yet leavened bread made in haste before the departure of the Jews from Egypt. In the Morgan Picture Bible, Pharaoh, finally chastened from the plagues, summons Moses and Aaron, ordering them to gather up the Jewish people and to get out. So the Israelites, a ragtag bunch of all ages, bear sacks and walk off to the edge of the page, led by a floating column. That's the column that's jutting out from the margin. This column is a visual reference to the pillar of fire that guided the travel of the Israelites through the desert. So here, Pharaoh grants their freedom, and the column, like a divine GPS, leads them out. But by excluding Pharaoh from the image in the Rylands Haggadah, the image glosses over Pharaoh's actual role as liberator. Initially, he did, according to the biblical account, grant freedom to the Jewish people, even if he later experienced a change of heart. Instead, in the Rylands Haggadah, Pharaoh remains unremittingly cruel throughout the narrative cycle, in spite of the more nuanced approach taken in the Bible. No miraculous act or outrageous calamity could soften his stance. Pharaoh was the perpetually evil king. Without showing Pharaoh granting freedom to his Jewish slaves, one is also visually presented with the possibility that the Jewish people took advantage of the havoc wreaked by the plagues and proactively seized a moment to escape all on their own. Instead, the bad king only appears below the image, accompanied here by the foot soldiers and cavalry of the Egyptian army, bent on finding and destroying the Jewish people. But don't fear. Our story has a happy ending. God saves the Israelites by splitting the sea while the entirety of the Egyptian cavalry, men and chariots, and even horses met a soggy demise. And here is a detailed view where you can see an Israelite right in the front here who's craning his neck to catch a first-hand glimpse of the complete decimation of the Egyptian cavalry. And down below it, this is the nose of a horse. That's the wrong word, but you know what I meant. I would also like to remind all of you to catch a first-hand glimpse of this very page, which is on view upstairs, and as much as I can blow it up and show it in a humongous fashion, it's way more spectacular viewed in person upstairs. In the Morgan Picture Bible, you can see that the image has actually been split into a left and right composition, where the Egyptians are sort of falling over their horses, and it's a bit unclear even that they're drowning. It more looks like they've been somehow thrown off their horses after Moses just touches his staff into the water, which you can see this is the shore of the water as it appears on the image. And in the Doctoral's Picture Bible, we have another image which is split left and right, where the Egyptians now are drowned completely up to the tippy tops of their helmets by Moses, who has reached across the margin as interacting with the miniature on the opposite page to make the waters surge once again, and the Israelites can stand on shore saved. The Morgan Picture Bible and the Doctoral's Bible Cycle both separate the image vertically, so that on the left are the drowned Egyptians, while the Israelites stand unharmed on the shore. In the Rylands Haggadah, however, the image is divided into horizontal bands, placing the Israelites on dry land in the middle of the sea. By formatting the composition in this way, the miracle is actually in progress. The Israelites stand in the middle of the sea, but they no longer need to worry that the Egyptian army is following in hot pursuit. This marks the pivotal moment between slavery and redemption. And so, the Jewish people were saved, redeemed from slavery, free to roam the desert learning God's commandments, and a great celebration ensued. Miriam, sister to both Moses and Aaron, took out her timbrels, and the Jewish people erupted in a tremendous song of praise to God. And here's Miriam leading the song in the Kaufman Haggadah, and there they are below again, playing and celebrating. But wait, where's the festive celebration in the Rylands Haggadah, the grand finale, the triumphant dance? Instead, the image that follows the triumphant passage through the Red Sea depicts the slaughter of a lamb, the spreading of its blood on the doorposts of the Jewish people, and the roasting of its flesh, head, legs, entrails over the fire. Why is this image here? In the biblical sequence, this should have happened before God smote the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. After all, it was the blood-stained doors of the Israelites that spared them of this grim fate. And in the Morgan Picture Bible, right over here, you can see that the two acts are actually happening simultaneously. One boy slits the throat of a lamb here, while the angel of death slits the throat of an Egyptian boy. Until this point, the biblical text quoted visually by the images in the Rylands Haggadah maintain the original sequence of the book of Exodus, beginning with the first verse of chapter 3 and finishing visually with the triumphant words at the end of chapter 14. So how can we understand this image, and why is it here, in place of a dramatic and triumphant celebration of Thanksgiving? And who doesn't love partying? According to the caption given by the Rylands Library, this pair of images represents the kitchens and the dining room of a Jewish home. So, seen in that way, the Seder meal is being prepared above and being eaten below. But there is one big problem with this interpretation. In the Middle Ages, there was a great discomfort around roasting a lamb for the Passover Seder, lest it be confused with the Zevach Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, the animal offering made at the temple in Jerusalem for Passover. After the destruction of the temple in the 1st century CE, the practice of sacrifice was stopped, replaced exclusively with prayer. So Maimonides ruled that it was permissible to serve lamb at the Seder, but only if it was sliced or boiled or missing a limb, but it could never be roasted and eaten whole. Therefore, it is more likely that this image is actually meant to connect the very first celebration of Passover in Egypt with the modern celebration of the Seder below it, since it was thought that at midnight, as the blood of the lamb dripped on the doorposts of the Jewish people in the land of Egypt, it became Jewish law that every subsequent generation would remember the days of emancipation until God and his mighty arm reappeared on earth. So these images, the slaughter and the roasting of the Paschal lamb and the Seder below it, bring the viewer out of Egypt and into today. The Passover ritual, then the lamb sacrifice, and now the Seder, became the triumphal celebration of the miraculous Exodus. And as a provocative footnote, I just want to highlight one other connotation given by the image of a lamb roasting over an open fire. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, was also represented literally and visually as the Lamb of God. So, although this image has an important ritual purpose, some viewers may have seen it subtly, or not that subtle, of a subversive image, that roasting over the open flame. Thus, the imagery propels the Seder participant from the vivid imagery of the Exodus directly into the ritualized feast. The one-time biblical celebration of the miraculous redemption of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt has been replaced, superseded by the Passover Seder, the festival meal celebrated in every generation. And here we have two generations seated side by side, an older generation and a younger generation. As the viewer winds his way through the pictorial account of redemption from slavery in Egypt and then beyond, from that first cup of wine to the final blessing over the fourth, the Seder participant is guided from the biblical past through the ritual present and on to the redemptive future. Taken all together, this biblical introduction to the Seder text provides several important messages. First, corrupt behavior will be punished harshly by God, while faith will be rewarded, at least eventually. And second, God, lover and protector of the Jewish people, will return and once again redeem his Jewish people, provided that his first awesome act of redemption is suitably remembered. It is in this context of gratitude, obligation, and hope that the Jewish people celebrate the Passover Seder, awaiting the divine springtime, the return of God's presence to earth, the eternal salvation of the Jewish people. The Exodus from Egypt was an event of utmost religious significance, an experience indelibly printed on the collective memory and imagination of the Jewish people. It was never thought to have been a simply historical event, but rather it became a permanent affirmation of God as the supreme protector of the Jewish people and the paradigm for the future redemption. By commemorating this sacred event at the Seder, a meaningful and cyclical sense of time is achieved, through which participants identify the historical here and now with the biblical past and the redemptive future. By appropriating and adapting Christian imagery in this specifically Jewish context, visual paradigms were adapted, used, and reused, and ultimately imbued with new meanings and new possibilities. The Rylands Haggadah is an exemplar of the visual dialogue and aesthetic creativity that is intrinsic to Jewish art. By resituating it and other Hebrew manuscripts within the broader context of medieval art and manuscript illumination here at the Met, the complex process through which a Jewish patron drew upon a common visual language, actively adapting Christian motifs in order to construct a Jewish message became apparent, providing a vision of a Jewish community that was not segregated, blind, and marginal, but was vibrant, creative, acculturated, and capable of the most sumptuous artistic production. Ultimately, differences can coexist challenge and affirm, while not being destructive in an expanded and shared cultural space. Thank you, and Shana Tova.